Hello everyone, it's me the Warhammer Complainy Guy, Revan/Handi, destroyer of wallets, maker of terrible financial decisions, here to give you a TLDR of the magic of the hobby that is Warhammer 40,000. Anyways, before you dive into Space Marine 2, or already have depending on when you see this video, because Space Marine 2 made you want to explore more about this hobby, or you're just curious to see what it's all about. And if you are, I guess that elaborate video game disguised as an advertisement for a miniature war game has done its magic, which is heresy. Anyways, what is Warhammer 40,000? Well, I'm not going to explain everything like the Horus heresy, because that kind of gets us to where we are now, but the universe of Warhammer 40,000 is a future where humanity is assaulted from all sides by many different factions of Xenos, and even some humans corrupted by the ruinous powers of chaos. In Warhammer, there are no good guys, although humanity is always number one, so you could argue that the Imperium and Man are the good guys, but honestly, the more you learn about the setting of Warhammer, the more you understand that in the grim dark future, there is only war. And since you're watching this video either before or after the release of Space Marine 2, you should already be familiar with the term Space Marine. More specifically, the Space Marine chapter of the Ultramarines, which are the poster boys of Warhammer 40k that are literally on every single piece of Warhammer 40k related media, be it advertisements, animations, edition boxes, or even merchandise. But the Ultramarines are the Space Marine chapter you think of when someone says Warhammer 40,000. I'm also sure you've heard a lot of people say that Warhammer is kinda wacky. Now it's not as wacky, but there are still some elements of it left, like the giant robot farm equipment turned war machines, or just the orcs running on the power of belief, like Wall Street. Also, I should let you know that Warhammer is a satire and that the Angry Marines are the best Space Marine chapter. Shout out to the Coscodian Shield Captains. But in Space Marine 2, you fight one of the many factions that exist on the tabletop, the one front and center being the Tyranids, which is this giant hive mind of space bugs which eats everything in their path to gain biomass, that are classified into hive fleets like Leviathan, Behemoth, and many other names of mythological beasts. The Tyranids are this species that is always evolving and adapting to everything they encounter, which makes them this existential threat that's always escalating in the setting, making you wonder, can anyone ever really win? So make sure you do your part. And then there's the second enemy in the game we know about because chaos always has to show up, the Dusty Boys, the Sons of Magnus, the Traitor Legion of the Thousand Sons. Also obligatory, Magnus did nothing wrong. The Thousand Sons are this really cool Egyptian themed Chaos Space Marine chapter that is one of the few Space Marine legions that is filled with a ton of psychers, since Magnus, their Primarch, is one of the most powerful psychers in the galaxy aside from the God Emperor of mankind. Also, I should make a note here that I'm making this video before the release of Space Marine 2, so there might be a third secret faction, but I have no idea, so if there is, neat! Now, some of the other factions of Warhammer 40k are of course the many flavors of Space Marines, my personal favorite being the Dark Angels and Grey Knights, the Dark Angels being the faction that is heavily inspired by Arthurian legend, and go read Lion Son of the Forest, really great book, I highly recommend you read it if you're interested in the lore of Warhammer 40k. And the Grey Knights are this super secret Space Marine chapter that are honestly really cool, but the way they were written in lore made a lot of people not very happy because they just turned into the Silver Ultramarines. Then we have the Imperial Agents, which is the super religious nuts of the Inquisition. Then we have the Nuns with Guns, the Sisters of Battle, this ultra religious faction of the Imperium that thinks Space Marines are abominations. One of my four armies, the Golden Bananas, also known as the Adeptus Custodes, think Space Marines but on that Captain America superhero serum, incredibly overpowered in lore and sometimes on tabletop, but probably one of the easiest factions to paint and collect. Then you have the Toaster sorry, I mean the Adeptus Mechanicus, which are basically a bunch of tech-obsessed cultists that crave the certainty of steel, because in the end we all understand the weakness of the flesh. Then there's the Green Army Men of the Imperium, the Wall of Meat, otherwise known as the Imperial Guard, which is composed of the average men and women of the Imperium unless they're from Catachan. So think artillery, tanks, and a whole lot of miniatures you gotta paint. Then for the last Imperium faction, I'm gonna roll two into one. Even though one is rarely seen on the tabletop, you got the Megas XLR faction, because we dig giant robots, otherwise known as Imperial Knights and Collegia Titanica. Think of giant robots of various sizes that have things like giant chainsaws, pimp hands, lances, and guns that would make the shit we have today blush. Then when you go up to Titans, which cost a kidney or two, these things are the walking mountains, churches, or Bass Pro Shops, with weapons that can destroy a planet if you shoot the right place, or they literally fire a sun. Then for Chaos, of course, there are also many flavors of Chaos Space Marines, like the Always Angry Boys, the World Eaters, the Walking Plague known as the Death Guard, the Saturday cartoon villains known as the Black Legion, or even though they don't have any 40k minis, my personal favorite Chaos Space Marine Legion, I Am Alfarius, also known as the Alpha Legion. Then there's also Chaos Knights, which are just Imperial Knights but spikier, Chaos Demons composed of the many horrors of the Immaterium that spawn from the Chaos Gods of Tzeentch, Khorne, Nurgle, or Slaanesh. Then for the other Xenos factions, you got your many flavors of Space Elves with the Eldari, Harlequins, Drukhari, and Exodites, which don't exist yet on the tabletop because for some reason GW doesn't want to make them. Anyways, you also got your Tyranid aligned army of the Gene Stealer cults, and no, they don't steal your denim jeans, no matter how funny that would be. Then we have the Space Dwarves, also known as the Votan, and of course the obligatory Rock and Stone because you know I had to do it. The Robo Space Skeletons, the Necrons that also have a little bit of an Egyptian theme going on. You also got the goofiest little guys of the setting, the Orcs. Again, they run off the power of belief, so things like you ain't ever seen a purple orc, and red makes things go faster. Then finally we have the Tau, the most naive of all the factions in the setting that have a ton of advanced weapons that look like they came straight out of the Gundam universe. But that's pretty much all the factions that are available in Warhammer right now. Also, I just recently hit 8,000 YouTube subscribers, so if you're enjoying this video, I would really appreciate it if you could please subscribe to my YouTube channel and maybe also like the video too if you haven't already, because this is the part of the video where I get some audience interaction to help boost it to the almighty YouTube algorithm. But if you liked Space Marine 2 or are someone interested in the hobby side of Warhammer, let me know in the comments down below. Do you think you'll explore more Warhammer media, either it be the hobby itself or other video games? And for those that are already too deep into the hobby like I am, what army are you going to collect next? Because I know mine's going to be the funny rats. So now that you hopefully have an idea about all the armies in Warhammer, let's talk a bit about the hobbying side of Warhammer and what you need to get started. For those that don't know, I figured I should briefly mention that if fantasy is more your thing, Age of Sigmar and Warhammer Fantasy are also an option, because I know people might not find the futuristic setting of Warhammer 40k that appealing, but yeah, aside from the obvious requirements of you need to get some miniatures, before you go out and buy some miniatures, I want you to think about which army you're most drawn to. It could either be because of the lore or just because they look neat, which is otherwise known as the rule of cool, which is how I decided on all of my armies and also the Warlord Titan, which was my first ever Warhammer miniature. But Warhammer can get expensive, so be 100% sure about which miniatures you want. The rule of cool will also always win in the end because you're hopefully going to be the one painting your miniatures, and you're also always going to be the one staring at them on the display shelf. So make sure you get the stuff that you like and not the stuff that's meta if you do plan on playing the tabletop. But once you're sure about which army you want to collect, the next thing you need to ask yourself is, how do I even start collecting Warhammer 40k? One of the best ways to start Warhammer if you're not sure which army you want to collect is to get one of the 3 starter sets. Each starter set has more miniatures the higher you go up, and what's in these sets varies with each edition of Warhammer. For this edition, it's Space Marines versus Tyranids, and it's also a given, but every edition starter set will always have Space Marines in it. But once you are 100% sure about which army you want to collect, I recommend picking up either a Combat Patrol or one of the special edition army boxes if you can still find one floating around. Combat Patrols are usually the best way to start the army you want to collect, because each army will always have a Combat Patrol except for Knights for obvious reasons. There are also usually army starter boxes available when an army gets its codex with a new edition and around Christmas time. These are usually always going to be the best bang for your buck, because if you get one of these for your army you want, if it's a new special edition box, you will also get that army's codex included with the miniatures. And more often than not, all you need to get after that is a Combat Patrol to reach 2,000 points of miniatures, and maybe a few other miniatures you think look cool. But if you only want to paint the miniatures you think look cool regardless of what army they're from, then go ham, because GW does sell individual characters and vehicles, but after you've chosen your miniatures or army you want to collect, you now need to think about what hobby supplies you need. Some of the supplies you'll need to assemble your minis are glues like super glue or plastic glue, sprue cutters, various grits of sanding sticks and sponges, and maybe some gap filling mediums, and of course a hobby knife. For glues, I recommend Tamiya extra thin if you're working with plastic, and then if it's resin, just use super glue unless it's a Titanic large resin model, then you're gonna need some 2-part epoxy. Sprue cutters, you can either go the expensive God Hand route or just use model railroad cutters like I do. For sanding sticks, you can just get these value packs off of Amazon for cheap, even though you're realistically only ever going to use the high grit ones. Then for sanding sponges, I use disc space sanding sponges, which come in all the right sandpaper grits. Now for the painting side of the hobby, this video is already longer than my normal videos, and I'm not editing a 1-hour video. But there are tons, and I mean tons of videos out there on YouTube from great miniature painters on how to paint Warhammer, like our Lord and Savior Duncan Rhodes of the Two Thin Coats. But what I can do, of course, is give you some helpful tips, like having 1 or 2 good paintbrushes and either a brand name wet palette or a redneck wet palette like me. First is always to thin your paints. It's really easy to get a good paint consistency if you use a medicine dropper like I do, because more often than not, depending on how much paint is on your palette, 1 to 2 drops of water should be more than enough. Then after you've thinned your paints, always remember to paint at least 2 thin coats. Some colors require more, but always make sure your paint is thin enough to not cause brush marks. Then for colors you use to paint your miniatures, it's all up to you, but there are tons of miniature paint brands in the wild besides Games Workshop, like 2 Thin Coats, Vallejo, AK Interactive, Army Painter, and many more. Next, make sure you get some decent paintbrushes and make sure you take care of them, because you don't always need an expensive sable brush. Synthetic brushes will do just fine as long as you take care of them, so make sure after every painting session you wash your brushes with brush soap, or if the paint is too caked on, some isopropyl alcohol. Another thing to remember is when you rinse your paintbrushes between colors, have a separate paint cup for metallics and normal acrylic paints, because if you're rinsing normal paints and metallic paints together, you might get some metallic flakes where you don't exactly want them. But now let's talk a bit about the gameplay side of Warhammer, because Warhammer isn't just about painting miniatures, it also has a tabletop game. You don't exactly have to play the game to participate in the hobby of Warhammer, just know that each army is unique with how it plays. The rules can be good sometimes and also bad sometimes. Your favorite unit might not be that great on the tabletop, and that's fine because it honestly happens to everyone eventually. The rules are also not that hard to remember once you've played a few games. If you do want to learn how to play Warhammer before you get into the nitty-gritty like primary and secondary objectives, just play a kill everything match to understand how the core rules work. If you do want to learn how to play Warhammer without buying the miniatures, I highly recommend trying Tabletop Simulator on Steam, because that's how I play Warhammer with my friends when I don't want to go outside. I do also have a Discord server if you're interested in learning more about the hobby of Warhammer, and everyone there is more than happy to help you start out on your hobbying journey. But now I feel like I need to mention some of the really important aspects of Warhammer that some people fail to mention to the newer players. The first one being the most obvious, which is that Warhammer is expensive. Every year so far without fail, the price of Warhammer just goes up. Warhammer is considered a luxury hobby now because the price for a single box of 3 to 5 Space Marines ranges anywhere from $50 to $70, while some units like vehicles are over $100 depending on the army, and singular characters, depending on their importance in the setting like Primarchs, can range anywhere from $40 to over $100. So collecting an army can add up really fast, and if you're not going the combat patrol or start collecting box route, on average the cost of a new army can range either from $600 to over $1,000, and this also isn't including if you're buying secondhand off of eBay. Warhammer can also take up a lot of time depending on how fast you paint or how much you paint, but that honestly is like any other hobby. Since painting is what we do in our free time, so don't rush yourself when you paint, because I can guarantee if you sit down and take your time painting, you will be leagues happier with the results when you're finished. I also kind of forgot to mention that if you are going to play the tabletop side of Warhammer, games can take anywhere from 2 to 4 hours. Then finally is space. Now, if you only plan on collecting one army, this won't be an issue, but if you're like me and are going to be approaching 5 armies soon, space can really become an issue. More so if you have a ton of large models like me. Thankfully, IKEA makes some really good glass display cases for all your miniature display needs. Hashtag not sponsored. I recommend either the Blauladin, and either the single or double door fabric core. Please keep this in mind if you're gonna start Warhammer. The plastic toy soldiers are gonna need a place to be displayed if you're not gonna be using them for a game, or just a spot to show people that visit you. I should also like to note that if you like to hoard all the pretty boxes and leftover bits like I do, I hope you got enough space under the bed or in your closet. But yeah, if you are interested in the hobby that is Warhammer 40k because of Space Marine 2, I hope you will take my advice to heart because Warhammer is a really fun hobby once you get into it, and if this hobby is for you, I hope you'll enjoy it for years to come. As always, thank you once again for watching this video. Don't forget if you want to support the channel, simply leaving a comment and hitting the like and subscribe button helps more than you think. And also maybe join my Discord server too so I can see all your cool miniatures. And becoming a channel member also helps too since it allows me to make up bullshit excuses to my parents about why I totally need to get an Ares gunship, since that was a suggestion that's been thrown out a couple times for the end of the year subscriber goal. And in my infinite stupidity, I said on stream that I would get another Warlord Titan at 20,000 YouTube subscribers. Anyways, I have to go make more terrible financial decisions, so I will see you on the next video, and remember, being poor is a choice.